This is Dr. Michael Cameron, and this is the Registered Behavior Technician Module 15. With respect to the strand in terms of the Registered Behavior Task List, this comes from A05, which falls into the category of measurement. And the title of this presentation is to enter data and update graphs. The duration of this presentation is a little bit longer. It will be 90 minutes, and there will be a competency-based quiz at the end, 5 questions as usual. With respect to demonstration recommendations at the conclusion of this training, I suggest that you ask your BCBA supervisor to show you the graphing system that they use. So for example, we've talked quite a bit during these modules about the possibility of using cloud-based or internet-based systems such as that offered by Central Reach for the purpose of using tablets or iPads and doing your data collection system conveniently on those devices. And then those devices will also automatically graph data for you. So if your BCBA supervisor is using one of those systems, certainly get an overview and take a look at how data are entered into the system and how the data are graphed as well. Now, other BCBA supervisors may be using hard copies of graphs, and that's quite fine too, of course. But you want to get a look at those. You want to see what graph data looks like based on your BCBA's work, and it'd be worth your time just spending a little bit of time reviewing that. I also recommend that you rehearse transferring data from a data sheet over to a graph. So it could be a hard copy of the data sheet and you're transferring it over to Excel, or you're entering data into a system like Central Reach, and that is getting automatically graphed. But you'll want to rehearse that process of doing that. I will say that if you develop skill and capability in terms of not only entering data but also transferring data from data sheets to graphic form, or transforming it from data collected on an iPad or a tablet and electronically graphing it. If you can master those skills, you'll be a tremendous assistance to the BCBA supervisor that you're working with. So it's good for your own skill development, good for your own professional development, but it'll also be a great aid for the BCBA supervisor as well. Finally, at the end, you'll want to demonstrate your ability to collect and graph data for the clients that you'll be supporting. Now, before getting started, one of the things that I did in preparation for meeting with all of you for this next module, Module 15, I did an overview from all the modules, and I'm referring to it here as an inventory of learning. So I'm reflecting on all those things that you've learned to date going through this training. You've invested a lot of time and energy in terms of going through the Registered Behavior Technician training, and I just wanted to just do a check-in with you, just do a reminder in terms of all those things that you've learned already, and to congratulate you, quite frankly, for achieving so much so far. So first, you've learned about the formal definition of applied behavior analysis. This is our science, and it's very important to be anchored by the formal definition of the science, and you got that right at the very beginning. You also learned about the scientific method, because behavior analysis is a science, and we follow the scientific process. We describe phenomenon, we describe behavior, we explain it, we predict it, we ultimately control it. And control is also something I want to note is always for the benefit of the individual that we're serving. You also learned about the behavior analysis process, how we go about the entire process of developing operational definitions for behaviors, and then observing those behaviors, and ultimately doing formalized assessments, which I'll touch base on in a minute. But you've learned about the behavior analysis process as well. You've also learned about your professional community. This is critically important. The credential here as Registered Behavior Technician is being offered by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, and it's just critically important that you understand the function of that board, and we reviewed that in one of the earlier modules. You've also learned about some of the luminaries in the field. You've learned about B.F. Skinner and Edward Thorndike and the important contributions that they've made. You've learned about B.F. Skinner as a basic researcher and a lot of the contributions that he made that set the foundation for the entire field of experimental analysis of behavior and for behavior analysis in general. You've learned about your scope of responsibilities as a registered behavior technician. You learned about all those things that you'll be doing, how you will function, those job skills that you'll be demonstrating on a regular basis. You learned about the importance of professional development, and I just want to remind you, and I have done that throughout the course of the modules, it'll be really important for you to get engaged with the literature, to be reading journal articles, to be reading summaries and abstracts of research and developments in the field of behavior analysis. And also, if you have the opportunity and the resources, it's always great to attend one of the local conferences or a national conference or an international conference. And I should mention to you that each state has either one or multiple chapters of their own in terms of their membership to the Association for Behavior Analysis International. So by way of example, I come from originally from the state of Massachusetts, and we have the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, and they have an annual conference referred to as the Babbitt Conference. So you want to look in your own state and see what local chapters are there, and consider attending one of those conferences. You've learned about professional boundaries and the importance of maintaining professional boundaries with families, with clients, with other professionals that you're working with. You've also learned about client dignity and maintaining a client dignity. You've learned about normalization. We talked a lot about Wolf-Wolfensberger and normalization and what we're trying to achieve with the individuals that we're serving, and that is to normalize their lifestyles and to give them opportunities across all those things you and I enjoy. We enjoy our capacity to receive education, to attend school, whether it be public school or private school. We enjoy vocational opportunities and employment opportunities. We want to extend all those same opportunities to the individuals that we're serving. You've learned about stakeholders and people that are defined as stakeholders, family members, most importantly. You know, they are center stage with respect to that. You've learned about what it means to take a strength-based approach and the importance of identifying that person's strengths, that person who you're working with, who you're serving, identifying what their strengths are, what their capabilities are and abilities are, and using that information to teach exactly everything to them and to work with them effectively. And it doesn't matter who you are, or what level of disability an individual has. If you look closely, if you care enough to look, you will find their strengths. And use that for the benefit of program development and ultimately for their benefit. You learned about the formal definition of evidence-based practice, and you know that in the field of behavior analysis, and you know that within your role as a registered behavior technician, you will have the responsibility of only using evidence-based practices. You've learned about skills assessment. This was a great presentation. You've learned about the various types of skills assessments. It could be norm referenced, it could be criterion referenced, it could be curriculum based. You've learned about a large variety of assessment methodologies that we use. And you also know that the kind of assessment that we use will be based on the individual, their needs, the reasons that they were referred to us, their funding source. So any BCBA has to have an entire battery of possibility in terms of assessment tools that they can use. That those assessment tools are going to fall into those categories. They're either going to be norm referenced or criterion referenced or curriculum based, and that's what you will assist with the permission and the supervision of the board certified behavior analyst. You learned all about functional behavior assessment. We do FBAs for the purpose of evaluating problem behavior, behavioral excesses, and you've learned about the continuum of rigor in terms of that kind of assessment. And we discussed at length the functional analysis processes as well. And I introduced you to Dr. Brian Iwata, who developed that process for us and made some very significant contributions in the field. You've learned about the measurable dimensions of behavior. You've learned about data collection processes, continuous data collection and discontinuous data collection. You've learned about permanent product data and what role it plays in terms of our work. You've learned about behavior intervention technologies and how this entire data collection process can be made fairly easy as a result of using behavior intervention technologies. And if you're fortunate enough to work with a BCBA that is using such technologies, then you will benefit from that as well. You've learned about the anatomy of a behavior intervention plan, what they look like, what the components are that are necessary to guide your work with an individual. You've learned about some of the basic principles already, reinforcement, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and you've learned about all the categories of reinforcement as well. And remember the mnemonic device that I gave you, gut, TV, visual, gustatory reinforcement, olfactory reinforcement, tactile reinforcement, and the list goes on. You'll always want to remember those because you want to get really creative in terms of how you're arranging reinforcement for people. You've learned about different types of reinforcement. There's primary, which is the unconditioned, there's secondary, which is conditioned, and then generalized reinforcement. You've learned about socially mediated reinforcement, that is reinforcement coordinated by another person, that being different from automatic reinforcement that does not require any kind of social interaction. You've learned about the primary functions of behavior. Remember the mnemonic device I gave you, SEAT, S for sensory, consequences maintaining behavior, E for escape and avoidance, and A for attention, and T for tangible. You've learned about ABC recording and scatter plots and how helpful scatter plots can be to identify patterns in behavior and to identify some of the reasons why behaviors may be occurring. You've learned about preference assessment and reinforcer assessment. And equally as importantly, you've learned about the aesthetics and the aesthetic arrangements of the programs that you design. They have to be appealing, they have to be culturally acceptable, they have to be attractive if they're going to be accepted. You've learned about inter-observer agreement, some of those things that your supervisor will do and check on when they're working with you directly in the field. The inter-observer agreement's a big part of that. You've learned about procedural reliability. You've learned about the feedback that you'll get from your supervisor. And you also learned about some of the associations that you may ultimately belong to. The Association for Behavior Analysis International, ABAI, the Association for Professional Behavior Analysts, APBA, and finally you've learned about the diverse applications of behavior analysis. It's a very exciting field. And in one of the last modules, we talked about behavioral forensics, but there's behavioral medicine, and there's organizational behavior management, and there's teaching and using behavior analysis for the purpose of teaching. So a very exciting field, and I just thought I would take a few minutes here and just remind you about the big, rich inventory of learning that has already occurred with all of you. And I'm excited to bring you forward now at this point and progress through this next module. Okay, so the goals for this module are as follows: to first of all remind you of why we do the work that we do for the client, of course, and that is the reason. To review the reasons for displaying data graphically. Third, to review the various types of graphs you'll use as a registered behavior technician. Next, to introduce you to the practice of visual analysis of data. And then finally, to discuss data variability, level, and trend. One of the things I just want to remind you of is that one of the hallmarks of behavior analysis happens to be a commitment to the data collection process and data collection in general. And once again, the reason for this is because we make database decisions. We make decisions based on very important information that we have, and that takes the form of data. These are things that you and I expect in our own lives, quite frankly. For example, if you go to a primary care physician, and that primary care doc does not even look at your chart, for example, and prescribes you, let's say it's an antibiotic, and did not realize that that you happen to be allergic to antibiotics, that you can't take antibiotics, you have an intolerance for them, you have very negative side effects as a result of taking antibiotics. And that may be very important data. There may be some very clear data that shows that when you've taken antibiotics in the past, you've had some pretty alarming allergic reactions. Important information that should be in your chart, important information that your primary care doc should be looking at and know about. If that doc made a recommendation for an antibiotic, you would be upset. You would feel like the person did not care enough to look at your chart, to look at who you are as a patient, to look at the data that should be informing them in terms of the decisions. So we take that same standard in terms of how we want to be treated. And we want people to make database decisions about us. And in turn, we will make database decisions about the people that we've been privileged and honored to serve. So that is what this is all about. Now, in order to do that, it's essential that we have a process. That data has to be organized in some way, summarized in some way. It means to have some. We need to bring some sense making to the data. Otherwise, it is just not conducive to evaluation. So, just a reality check, real quickly here. We collect and present data about what? Well, about client learning, and also about the behaviors that we've targeted, maybe their behavioral excesses, for example. We analyze data and collaborate with the team on methods for improving outcomes. So as a result of this dynamic process of looking how the individual is responding to our skill acquisition programs, how they're responding to our behavior intervention plans, we collaborate, we work with the team, we include the family, and we identify new methods for improving outcomes. Maybe the person has made good progress, and maybe we want to bring them to a new level, and maybe the data will tell us we're ready to go to a new level. So that kind of collaboration needs to occur. Maybe the person is not making progress, and it's critically important that we do some problem solving in terms of next steps, so the data will guide us in that direction. But this is an endless process. It's a dynamic process, and one that you'll be doing all the time with your BCBA supervisor and also other members of the team that you happen to be working on. Subsequent to that, the analysis of the data, the collaboration with the team, we make revisions in programs, and then we test our modifications. So as a result of revising a skill acquisition program, as a result of revising a behavior intervention plan, we're going to put the new changes to the test. And we're going to see what the data tells us about the changes, and whether we're on the right track or not, whether or not we need to completely renegotiate all over again. Then when appropriate, we need to include the process of data collection and review to promote self-management and self-monitoring. I cannot emphasize this enough. I mentioned before in one of the previous modules that our ultimate goal is to promote self-efficacy, self-determination, self-control, and we want to empower the individual that we're working with to take ultimate and complete responsibility for their lives. And in turn, we also want to empower families for being self-sufficient and maintaining their own abilities and capabilities to manage. They are the lifelong shepherds in terms of their children and young adults, sons and daughters. So the more we can empower them, the better. So when appropriate, we're actually teaching the client, that person we're serving, to collect data and to review data on their own. Or if the family is involved, we're teaching them to do the data collection and to evaluate changes as well. And that brings me to my final point. Family members are interventionists as well, and they too can be data collectors, and they too can be individuals who are engaged in the process of reviewing data and making a determination about change. So traditional behavior analysis relies on what is referred to as visual inspection of graph data. And we do that to evaluate the effectiveness of interventions. What interventions? Skill acquisition programs, interventions we have in place that promote skills. We do it for the purpose of looking at the behavior intervention programs that we have in place as well, and whether or not they're being effective. So the responsibility here is to take data from our data sheets, whether it be an electronic system or hard copy, and get it transferred over to graphic form. Once done, the primary function of the graph data is to communicate information about the results of your interventions. That's what we're looking for those graph data to tell us. And then properly graphed data will show the relationship between what's referred to as our independent variables, and those are the things that we do, that we're in control over, the interventions that you and your team put in place. So those are the independent variables. And we're looking for the relationship between that, the independent variables, and the dependent variables. What are dependent variables? They're outcomes. So the target could be pro-social behavior, social behavior, problem behaviors that you're trying to reduce. We're looking to see what that relationship is between the intervention we put in place and the outcomes we're looking for. We want the data to tell us whether or not there's a functional relation between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Because if there's not, then it'll be our obligation and our responsibility to make changes in the individual's program. And then finally, graph data will support database instructional decision making, and it'll inform the entire process. And we've discussed that pretty extensively throughout the Registered Behavior Technician modules. Okay, just a reminder in terms of the kind of information that you're tracking. Recall that at the beginning of the process of working with an individual, you did some kind of assessment with them. I'm just giving one example here. Once again, it could be the VB map, or it could have been the Vineland, it could have been a social skills rating scale, it could be any number of assessments. So what's important to note is that the assessment will provide a guide in terms of what we need to be working on. And what we need to be working on gets addressed through our programs. And the programs are designed for the purpose of building skills and advancing that individual. So perhaps as a result of the VB map, we learn that an individual has deficits in terms of language skills, communication skills, play skills, social skills, capacity to be in a classroom and interact appropriately in the context of a classroom. As a result of gaining that information, we then develop individual programs in order to address the skills and the development of the skills needed in order to make that person achieve important milestones in their lives. So a lot of information that we're tracking will come right from the assessment, and the VB map is just one example. Okay, recall as well that you've done a functional behavior assessment, an FBA. So the FBA will give us information about the hypothesized function of behavior, and then we develop our interventions based on the hypothesized function of behavior, and then those interventions are informed because we know something about what is motivating the individual. So the interventions are informed, they're crafted, they're developed based on the important information that we know. So you're tracking that. How are my interventions working? As a result of the FBA process and the development of the program, it's now time to make a determination as to whether the interventions are actually working or not. So I've got my skill programs in place, I've got my behavior intervention plans in place, and it's my responsibility to now assess the progress of individuals. But it doesn't end there. Recall that I've also emphasized the importance of family assessments, and one example that I gave in one of the earlier modules is the KIPS. It's an acronym, Keys to Interactive Parenting Scale. Just an exceptional assessment of family skills and abilities and knowledge. So one of the other things that we'll want to track is how is that family progressing through this curriculum that we've developed. So we're bringing along their skills. We're teaching them very important skills so that they can effectively manage and work in a healthy way and to support in a healthy way the child that is in their life or the adolescent that's in their life. So the KIPS, which is an assessment, will give us important information too. And as a result of our parental support and our parent training process, we can get evidence of a parent's progress as well. So those are all the things that we're tracking. So specifically, data on instructional programs, data on functionally equivalent replacement behaviors we may have identified to compete with the maladaptive behaviors that we've targeted for deceleration. We're looking for support and evidence of a behavioral cusp. You remember that term. We want to ensure that we're giving a person access to new environments, for example, that multiple people are impacted as a result of the good programs that we put in place. We're looking at data that may be collected by family members or teachers from a public school or a private school that you're working in. And then finally, you're looking to review the direct measures that you've identified. They could be frequency counts or durations, or the indirect measures, partial interval count. And our choice of data collection will, of course, depend on what aspect of behavior we're trying to change. So your graphs are going to tell the story here. They're going to tell the story about how we're doing with the skill acquisition programs. They're going to tell the story about how we're doing with the behavior intervention plan. They're going to tell the story about how we're doing in terms of bringing along families and in terms of their own development of skills, knowledge, and abilities. And those graphs will contain a variety of different kinds of data. Continuous data, discontinuous data will be plotted on those graphs. So I just wanted to get you anchored and grounded here in terms of reminding you about what we're tracking and the reason for it. Now, the different types of graphs that you will come in contact with include the scatter plot. This is one that we've discussed at length. This is a format whereby you'll be looking at the areas where there's evidence of some kind of behavior that you're tracking. So this is the kind of plot that you will be examining regularly as a result of doing scatter plots with your BCBA supervisor. The other form of graph that you will look at on a routine basis is what's referred to as an equal interval chart, an equal interval graph. The reason this is called an equal interval graph is because the distance between numbers, regardless of where you are on the ordinate here, is equal. So if you go from 10 to 20, for example, then that is equivalent in terms of distance from 10 to 20. It's the same as going from 50 to 60. One of the concerns about an equal interval chart, of course, is that with respect to progress, the distance between 10 and 20, it's a difference of 100%. However, if you go from 50 to 60, that's only a difference of 20%. So why is it that on the equal interval chart it looks the same in terms of the distance between those numbers? So although you'll use the equal interval chart on a regular basis, I just want to begin this process of pointing out some of the concerns that exist with equal interval charts. But this is one form that you'll be looking at on a fairly consistent basis. You'll also be looking at bar graphs. as well. Bar graphs tend to present data in terms of percentages, for example, or averages, for example. This is a bar graph on family stress. It's an interesting bar graph, actually. And this is some research that was done by the Interactive Autism Network, and I give you their web address right there. But they looked at family stressors and the percentage of people reporting moderate or great negative impact as a result of a disappointment in treatment, mere exhaustion, getting treatment, that is the coordination of treatment. So many individuals that you'll be serving, for example, will require a variety of different forms of treatment: speech and language pathology, occupational therapy, physical therapy, behavior analysis. So just the coordination for a family can be very difficult. Families can experience stresses as a result of setbacks. So regression could be as a result of school ending and moving into the summer months, and there are some major setbacks feasibly there. An individual's behavior, child's behavior, and them worrying about the future. So you can see 88% of families identify that as a great or moderate stress in their lives, and the child's behavior ranks at 72%. This is why I'm really spending a little bit of time on this particular graph, not only because it's one that you'll be looking at in terms of bar graph, but I just want to remind you of the importance of your role. You know, as a registered behavior technician, you're assisting families. You are helping individuals in so many different ways, and you can impact a family's level of stress as a result of your own competence and your good work and your own dependability. You can have an impact here in a very important way. But these are things that families are concerned about. They get disappointed. They get disappointed in treatment. They physically get exhausted as a result of the energy and the resources that they're putting into the care for their children. They spend a lot of time just coordinating treatments in general. Really takes the skills of a project engineer in many ways. But this is another kind of graph that you'll be looking at. It's a bar graph. And that is in addition to the equal interval chart that I showed you. Another kind of graph that you'll be looking at is what is referred to as a cumulative record. So what this means is that it is an additive kind of graph. So as you make additions to something, you'll see the acceleration of the line. So, you know, a great example of a cumulative record is, you know, you go to your local community and you're driving by the local school, for example, and they're doing a fundraiser, and they got that thermometer out in front of the school, and they're essentially showing you that they've accumulated $10,000 so far, and then you drive by a few days later and they'd have accumulated $20,000 or $30,000, and that red coloring in the thermometer is leveling upward, and it only goes upward. So this is the kind of graph that you'll be seeing as well. It's what's referred to as a cumulative record, and you could be collecting data in terms of the number of MANs that an individual has acquired over time as a result of your progressive work with the individual. So a cumulative record is an important piece of data as well. Now, for some of you, if you're fortunate, you will work in an environment where a standard behavior chart is being used. A standard behavior chart is something that I'll be talking about more extensively in the context of this module. However, it's an important chart because, unlike the equal interval chart, it will show a proportion of change. So the distance between one number and the next will be represented visually and appropriately on a standard behavior chart. And this is why it is often used by some board-certified behavior analysts as the preferred alternative to the equal interval chart because it does provide a more accurate and true visual picture. And I'll review this one as well in a little bit more detail as we move on. So the standard acceleration chart, the equal interval chart, equal interval graph, the bar graph, the cumulative record, scatter plots, these are all things that you'll be reviewing to make a determination about an individual's progress. Now, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on describing the anatomy of a graph because it'd be important for you as a registered behavior technician to understand what you're looking at and how you're looking at it. The first thing I want to describe on this graph is what's referred to as the x-axis, also synonymously called the horizontal axis, also referred to as the abscissa. So x-axis, horizontal axis, abscissa, those are three words that I want you to recall. But this axis, the x-axis, records units of time during which behavior is recorded. So it could be sessions, it could be days, it could be a day, it could be a week, for example. So the x-axis will be reserved for that. You're looking at sessions, you're looking at days, you're looking at weeks. And the numbers on this axis indicate the units of measure of time. That can be compared and contrasted to the y-axis, and the y-axis is also referred to as the vertical axis and also referred to as the ordinate. And the y-axis will communicate the behavior that's being recorded. So it could be MANS, for example, or it could be a maladaptive behavior. And then the numbers on the y-axis indicate the units of measurement of the behavior. So perhaps we're recording frequency. So the x-axis, units of time. The y-axis is reserved for units of measurement and behavior that we're measuring. The other thing I want to point out are the data points. Of course, this is simplistic. All of you certainly have plenty of experience looking at graph data and data points. There will be a legend on many graphs because at times multiple behaviors could be recorded on the same graph. So the legend will indicate to you that the filled circle, for example, as a data point means one thing or represents or designates one behavior. But if it's an open circle, it will designate or represent yet another behavior. But those are the data points on the graph. And then when we connect them, we create what's referred to as a data path. So right here, I'm looking at a data path. And this is something very important to us. And we'll be discussing a little bit more later on because it has great relevance in terms of how we go about doing our analysis. Okay, so we got the horizontal axis, also referred to as x-axis, also referred to as abscissa. We've got our y-axis, also referred to as the ordinate or the vertical axis. On the x-axis, we're looking at units of time. On the y-axis, we're looking at units of measurement. And this is going to be common across the graphs that you're looking at. We've got our data points, we've got our data paths as well. Now, one of the other very important things I want to point out to you are what's referred to as condition change lines. So whenever your board certified behavior analyst, for example, makes a change in a program, they will drop into that graph what's referred to as a condition change line. The reason you want to have that visually is because you want to see, take a look right here, during baseline, what's going on with respect to a particular behavior. This is referring to hitting behavior. So self-injurious behavior. How many hits occurred per minute? That's my rate. I'm looking at the rate per minute. So how many are occurring per minute? And then I put my intervention in place, for example, a blocking intervention, then what happens to the behavior, subsequent to that intervention going in place? Well, I see this big deceleration. And I can see as a result of this condition change line just exactly when that intervention went in place, and then I get this nice deceleration in the self-injurious behavior. And then your BCBA supervisor drops another condition change line down, returns back to baseline, and look at, sure enough, the behavior begins accelerating again. They put blocking back in place and then decelerates again. So these condition change lines are a signal to you that some change has occurred, and it allows your eye to evaluate what was going on before that change occurred and what's going on after the change occurred. So these change lines on a graph play a very important role. And if you're doing your job correctly as a registered behavior technician and as a board certified behavior analyst, then you're putting changes in place in your programs, you're evaluating constantly, you're representing those changes with the change lanes, the condition change lines. We also finally have what's referred to as condition labels. So this is just the labeling of what you did as a result of that change. So you've got the blocking intervention in place, and that can be compared to the baseline condition, and it's just giving you a rich description in terms of what is going on within each of those phases. So once again, in summary, we have our x-axis. What are some synonyms there? Well, the horizontal axis, the abscissa. We've got our y-axis. What are some synonyms there? Well, the vertical axis, the ordinate. What is the x-axis? Record, units of time. The y-axis, units of measurement. Then we got our data points, our data path. We've got our condition change lines on the graph. We've got our condition labels. So this gives you a really great orientation. This is how you look at information, and that's the anatomy of a graph, and that's what you'll see from one to the next. They'll have the same configuration with respect to information on it. Now, once again, I've mentioned that the graphs are used for the purpose of decision making, and therefore they contain empirical information. We use these graphs for the purpose of communication with stakeholders. The graphs are providing summarization of data. It's organizing data for us in a way that the eye can view it. We can do a visual inspection of it. Once again, this is what we do in the field of behavior analysis. We're doing visual inspection of data. You've got the anatomy of the graph there, and I'm just giving you an orientation in terms of how you can begin looking at the information. Now, one of the things I mentioned a little bit earlier is that the other option in terms of graphic displays is what's referred to as the standard acceleration chart. So the graphic display here is going to be a bit different from other charts and graphs that you look at. Same system with respect to the x-axis, the horizontal axis, the abscissa. In this one, it's you're looking at successive calendar days. Same deal with the y-axis, the vertical, or the ordinate. We're looking at a count per minute of some particular behavior that we're tracking, for example. So this behavior is looking at a person's capacity to say what's referred to as Dolch sight words. And it's time sampling, looking at the number of correct responses over incorrect responses. And this is one of the features of the standard acceleration chart that's really nice, is that the practitioner using it, the BCBA using it, will plot the number of incorrect responses. So this one is showing you that there's errors that have been made at baseline on identifying the Dolch sight words. And here's your data path in terms of correct responses. Now you see what's happening right here is that there's a crossover. So the incorrect responses are declining, decreasing, decelerating, and the correct responses are increasing, accelerating, and you're getting a crossover and kind of what's referred to as a Jaws effect. So from a visual standpoint, it's very convenient to be looking at the learning picture and what is going on here with respect to that. Now, one of the other things I want to point out to you on the standard acceleration chart, there's what's referred to as aim stars. That's right here. And that indicates the frequencies you want to achieve. So this is where you're going. This is what you're trying to achieve with the individual. So for you as a registered behavior technician, for example, if you're starting right here, here's your baseline, here's your number of incorrect responses, here's your number of correct responses. It's really nice to see right on a chart, right on a graph, what is my aim? What am I trying to shoot for? Where am I trying to get? Because I'm motivated to get this individual there. So you can see with this individual, you got this nice acceleration of correct responding, and you've got this nice deceleration of incorrect responding. And let me just bring your attention now to what's referred to as the record floor, and that indicates the lowest possible non-zero frequency. So the lowest possible frequency. So the aim in terms of this graph is to bring the individual down to zero, which is below the record floor, and that was achieved on this graph. So you've got a record floor, and you also have what's referred to as a record ceiling, which is the highest possible frequency that can be achieved. You've got your aim star, you've got your record floor, and then you've got your data paths and your individual data points. And then the condition change lines are right here as well. You can see them in this graph. So a different form of graph. However, one of the reasons why a board-certified behavior analyst will want to use that is actually for several reasons. First, it assesses the ratio of correct and error frequencies. So that's one of the conventions of the graph, is that you're recording both correct and incorrect responses. This kind of graph also allows you to review what's referred to as straight line trends rather than learning curves. One of the nice features of the standard acceleration chart is that you can actually quantify that level of acceleration and that level of progress. That's one of the very appealing things about the standard acceleration chart. And then also, the standard acceleration chart is closely connected to an entire field of what's referred to as precision teaching. And the entire philosophy of the field is that the learner knows best, or the child knows best, and it is the responsibility of the teacher, or in your case, the registered behavior technician, in collaboration with your board-certified behavior analyst. It's your responsibility to alter the variables to produce the desired result. And that's what we take seriously. So I wanted to give you a bit of an orientation to the standard acceleration chart, because if you're fortunate enough to work in an environment that uses it, it'll be a level of precision that is essentially peerless. The person that developed the standard acceleration chart, his name is Dr. Ogden Lindsley. One of the things that I like to do and have done throughout the course of these modules is to introduce you to the luminaries in the field. And Dr. Ogden Lindsley was certainly one of them. He was a professor of education at the University of Kansas. There he is as a very dashing looking young man, and frankly, as a very dashing-looking older man as well. In the occasions I've had to sit in on his symposiums, for example, at professional conferences, he was older, and that is how I remember Dr. Ogden Lindsley. Just by way of some of his accomplishments, incidentally, some facts about him. He was the founder of precision teaching. And his entire philosophy was putting science in the hands of teachers and students. Once again, he put a big emphasis on self-control, self-monitoring, self-evaluation, self-management. So it started largely with him. Precision teaching is, I'll give you the definition here, it's a precise and systematic method of evaluating instructional tactics and curricula. And it involves basing educational decisions on changes in continuous self-monitored performance frequencies displayed on a standard acceleration chart. That's what precision teaching is all about. with respect to some of the other contributions of Dr. Ogden Lindsley, he coined the term behavior therapy. He made major methodological contributions to sleep research. He did a lot of work in the field of behavioral pharmacology and geriatric behavior prosthesis, and he emphasized measure feedback and giving feedback to individuals. And as I mentioned already, he created the standard acceleration chart as well. If any of you are interested more in this field of precision teaching, I highly encourage you to read an exceptional article by Dr. Carl Binder, and it's entitled Precision Teaching and Direct Instruction, Measurably Superior Instructional Technology in Schools. And that article is in the Journal of Performance Improvement Quarterly, and it was written by Dr. Carl Binder, who appears right here. Dr. Binder is also a member of the Standard Acceleration Society, and this is a society that encourages the development and growth of the science of human behavior and learning, and promotes the use of the standard acceleration chart to further that objective. So there are some of the luminaries in the field, some important people, and they made very important contributions to this entire field of graphic display. So I wanted to take a little bit of time there just to introduce you to these people, introduce you to the standard acceleration chart, and to give you a bit of an orientation. Okay, so far we've got information about you as a registered behavior technician. You'll be looking at scatter plots, you know that. You'll be looking at equal interval charts. You'll be looking at cumulative records. You've been given an orientation in terms of the anatomy of an equal interval chart and all the components of it, so that you can do the visual inspection yourself. And then I gave you a bit of an introduction here to the standard acceleration chart as well, and Dr. Ogden Lindsley and Dr. Carl Binder. Now, within your role as a registered behavior technician, and when you're looking at graphs, whether it be an equal interval graph or a standard acceleration chart, the question becomes, what am I looking for? Just what should I be focusing on? So I'm going to give you three aspects and three important points in terms of what you should be looking for, and what you could talk to your board-certified behavior analyst about as you see it on the graphs. The first one is what's referred to as variability, which means how often and to what extent the data points vary from one another. So you can see on the top of the graph here for Jane, very little variability. The extent that these data points vary with respect to the percentage of correct responding is very slight. It's almost flatlined. However, if you look down at Matt, you see a lot of variability. You know, this is somebody that's bouncing from 78% correct, 42%, up to probably 99%, plummeting back down to 40%, then bouncing back up to 80%, and then diving right down to 20%, and then for some reason achieving the near 100% level, and you see the continued bounce as it goes. So this is legitimately variability in performance, and there's implications for that. If you have variability in performance, then it's an indication of poor control over behavior. So sometimes you see variability in performance from one day to the next, even with just you as a registered behavior technician working consistently with the individual. Other times it can be variability because of various people working with the individual. So let's take Matt again by way of example. Maybe what we're not seeing on this chart right here is that on this high day of 100% correct, that was you working with the individual. I'm going to give you the credit for this data point right here and this data point over here as well. However, maybe there's another registered behavior technician that doesn't really have great instructional control or stimulus control over behavior, and we're going to give this data point to that person. So sometimes the variability in performance can be a byproduct of different staff or different individuals working with the person. But back to the main point, you're looking at different aspects of data. The first aspect is what's referred to as the variability. The definition is how often and to what extent the data points vary from one another. So you're looking for either a great variability, as we see with Matt, or we're looking for virtually no variability, as we're seeing with Jane. Now, just because we don't have a lot of variability here doesn't mean that there isn't a place for improvement in terms of performance. So the question for Jane, of course, is why is she hovering at 80% and why can we not get her to 100%? So although I don't have a lot of variability in this graph, or if any at all, I still have a decision to make in terms of her programming. And Matt, we certainly have decisions to be making as a result of his variability. So that's one of the first things you'll do as a registered behavior technician. You're going to be looking at the graphs. You're going to be looking at whether or not that data path and those data points are suggesting variability in performance. Because if it is, then you've got some explaining that has to occur. So we're following that scientific process, right? First we describe, so this is what's going on right in the graph. Then we need to explain, okay, well, why do we see that variability with Matt? And then we need to make changes and predict what's going to happen. And then ultimately we want to get to the point where we control behavior. So that entire scientific process overlays and gets superimposed right on our analysis of visual data. The next thing that you look at with respect to graphic display is what's referred to as the level of the data path. So the level is defined as the value around the vertical axis, and it's typically a mean or a median in which the data converge. So right here we got a high level of performance. So I would say the mean is probably somewhere around 90, 92, 93% right here. The level here for the second set of data points is more around the 51% mark, and down here it's probably around the 8% mark. So when we go from one phase of treatment to another, we'll look for what's referred to as a level drop, and you see that right here, or it could be a level jump. Could go on the other way. But you're looking at data points and you're looking to see how they converge around a mean or a median, and you're looking to see from one data set to another how they change. And then finally, the next thing we will look at on a graph is what is referred to as the trend of the data. And essentially what that means is what is the overall direction of a data path. What direction are we going? And the labels that we use, and you will use as a registered behavior technician as well, is that you could have a stable trend, and this display right here would represent that. That's a stable trend in behavior. Or you could have an ascending trend. So hopefully this is some skill that's being developed, right? We don't want that ascending trend with maladaptive behavior. But that kind of data display would be labeled as an ascending trend. Or we could have a descending trend, and hopefully this is the direction of a problem behavior and not the direction of a skill. Or we can have variability or a variable trend. So in summary, what you're describing to your board-certified behavior analyst when you're working with them is the trend of the data. You can say we got stability, or we got an ascending trend in terms of some skill that's being acquired, or we got a descending trend in terms of some maladaptive behavior that we're tracking, or we got a lot of variability in performance. But essentially, those are the three things that you'll be discussing with your BCBA supervisor. The variability of performance. You'll be talking about the level of behavior, and then finally you'll be talking about the trend or the overall direction of the data path. So that is your orientation to graphic display. Very important in the field of behavior analysis, because we we make all of our decisions based on data. I gave you a nice overview of the different different kinds of graphs that you'll be looking at, and introduce you to the equal interval chart, equal interval graph, but also the standard acceleration chart. And once again, I encourage you that if anybody here is looking to advance their knowledge in education and would like to do some reading and study in the area of precision teaching and direct instruction, I highly encourage this particular article by Dr. Binder and Watkins, and for you to do some of your own work in that particular area. With respect to the questions, which we always do at the end, list 2 reasons for displaying data graphically. Well, 1, to analyze data, and then 2, to make database decisions about progress. Who's the founder of precision teaching and the creator of the standard acceleration chart? That'd be Dr. Ogden Lindsley. Define the term level in reference to the analysis of quantitative data. That's the value around the vertical axis which the data converge, expressed as a mean or a median. Define the term variability in reference to the analysis of quantitative data. Well, it's how often, to what extent, that data points vary from one to another. And then finally, defining the term trend in reference to the analysis of quantitative data, the overall direction of a data path. And that concludes the module. Thank you for your attention, and I want to remind you once again the way we started this module, and remind you about your inventory of learning. I want to congratulate you on all the progress you've made so far, and I'm excited to bring you to the next module. I'll see you then.